So this video is going to cover 6.2 and 3, which is going to be over colonization in Africa and the Middle East. We're going to focus mostly on when Europeans actually arrived in those two areas and began taking over more and more of them. So some of the key vocabulary that you're going to have to focus on is right here. Paternalistic, you should star or highlight in your notes. This is governing a country as if it were a child. So the Europeans view their colonies in Africa and the Middle East as children who don't have any discipline. They're savages, and the Europeans need to come in and teach them how to be a real country. Shaka is going to be a Zulu chief. We'll talk about him. He's very powerful until the British arrive. Leopold is the king of Belgium. The Boer War is actually going to be a war between the Boers and Great Britain, and the Boers are white South Africans. Menelik II is the emperor of Ethiopia. We'll talk about him more. Elite is the upper class of a country, but they're not just the rich people. They're the people who actually have the power and make the laws. You should also star the Suez Canal. This is one of the most important waterways in the world. It allows ships to easily go from Europe to Asia, and they don't have to go all the way around Africa, so the Europeans are really going to want to control this area. So Europeans had always been in Africa. It's right across the Mediterranean from Europe. They're very close. Spain and Africa basically touch each other, but previously, Europeans had only been around the coast. They couldn't get into the interior of Africa. But the Industrial Revolution changes that because a lot of Europeans are now have the technology like steamboats and the telegraph to actually get into Africa. Quinine makes it so that not as many Europeans are dying from malaria. And very quickly, missionaries are the first ones that get into Africa. They spread Christianity, they spread medical facilities, they build schools, and at first the contact is mostly light like that, but we'll see over time the Europeans begin to take more and more land. So what we're going to go over now is the scramble for Africa, and this is where the European countries actually begin grabbing up all of the African nations and African tribes to bring them under their rule and actually imperialize the continent. So it starts at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where all the European powers, they come together and they meet in Berlin, because up to this point it had been a free-for-all in Africa, and they were just going around Africa claiming continents and countries, and it was beginning to cause friction between the European powers. So the goal is going to be for them to all agree on how to carve up Africa and avoid any wars between nations that want the same thing. Funny enough, they don't invite any of the native Africans, and they decide who's going to get what. So Leopold, the king of Belgium, gets the Congo to himself as his personal colony. France gets a lot of North Africa. They get a huge share of the continent, but it's mostly desert. Britain gets West Africa and Egypt, places like that. While their area is smaller, they got the good areas. They got the Suez Canal, and we'll see that in the next slide. Portugal and Germany get a little bit of the tropical areas and around the coast. Spain gets a little bit, but they agree to carve up Africa, and they do not invite the Africans because the Africans are not going to be able to resist them to begin with, and they're just going to be able to take the entire continent. So you can see here who got what. The French got this large share up here, but this is mostly desert. The British take control of the Nile River, but the critical thing the British get is they get this little thing right here, which is the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, so the British can easily transport their goods to India and from India. Very important part right there. So not all Africans just let the Europeans come in and take over their nations. In South Africa, the first people to resist are going to be the Boers, those white South Africans. They fight the British, but again, they're defeated. The British then go on to fight the Zulus, and the Zulus initially kind of beat the British in a few battles, but then the British bring in their official army, and again, the Zulus are defeated. The Algerians resist the French in North Africa, again, defeated. East Africa, a bunch of different tribes try to fight the Germans, and they're defeated. The Germans resort to something that they'll kind of become known for in war, which is very brutal warfare, burning down villages, burning crops. And eventually, the African elite who go to Europe and become educated began to demand self-rule and independence, but that won't happen all the way until the 1960s. Two major nations survive, and that's going to be Ethiopia and Liberia. So Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom under the king of Menelik II, and he sees what's happening in Africa, so he decides to modernize the country. He goes out and he begins building his own railroads, his own factories. He gets his own machine guns. So when the Italians arrive to try and colonize him, he can defeat the Italians and avoid being colonized. Liberia, on the other hand, is founded by slaves from the United States. So they're former slaves who were freed after the Civil War, and they immigrate to Liberia. They found their own colony. So the United States is like big brother to Liberia. If you attack Liberia, you're also going to be attacking the United States. Now we're going to move on to the Middle East, which is nations like Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and the European contact that happened with not as much vocab for this one. Pasha and Sultan are just two words that are going to kind of help you make sense of the Ottoman Empire. A Pasha is like a governor in the Ottoman Empire, and a Sultan is the Ottoman King. One that you should star is genocide. The genocide is the systematic and deliberate killing of certain people because of their racial, ethnic, cultural group. So the most famous genocide is obviously the Holocaust, where Hitler targeted people like the Roma and Sinti, and especially the Jews. A genocide could be where an army comes in and they target all the people with green eyes in an area, and it's not enough for those people to leave. They kill them because they simply have green eyes. Concessions are going to be rights given to foreigners, usually economic rights. So this would be like a country granting foreigners the ability to produce all their oil or sell them exclusively all their cotton. It's usually unfair, and the Europeans are usually going to force it on other nations. So the Middle East was pretty much all controlled by the Ottoman Empire at one point. They controlled the largest empire on the planet for a long time, and they pretty much kicked the Europeans' butts. But by the time we're talking about like the mid-1800s to late 1900s, they are absolutely falling apart. They face a lot of different issues, but two of the largest ones are nationalism and the demands of Western nations. So nationalism, we have to remember, is pride in your country, pride in your nation, and there's a lot of different ethnic groups and nations that the Ottomans rule. So it's not just Ottomans. There's Turks, there's Armenians, there's Serbians, there's Albanians, there's Arabs, there's Persians. And all those groups, not all of them want to be ruled by the Ottomans. They want to rule themselves. So this starts revolts against the Ottomans, which weakens them. The Western nations are also beginning to kind of nibble at the borders of the Ottoman Empire and take things and ask for concessions. The final thing that kind of like ruins the Ottoman Empire and makes a lot of the West not like it is the Armenian genocide. So the Armenians are Christians who live in Turkey, which is in the Ottoman Empire, and Turkish nationalism rises where the Turks demand that all the Armenians leave Turkey. And it goes from the Armenians need to leave Turkey to the Armenians in Turkey need to die. So over about a 20, 30-year period, 1 million Armenians are going to be killed by the Turks through forced marches, starvation, executions, and it's going to really scar the relations between Armenia and the Turks to this day. The Ottomans, just like Ethiopia, see that the Europeans are like growing ahead and are beginning to colonize a lot of areas, so they attempt to modernize also. They build their own railroads, they improve their education system, they hire Europeans to come down and train their military. If you look at the picture down here in the right-hand corner, you can see the Ottoman military, and it's a modern military. They have rifles. They just look like any other European army. They also send these guys, known as the Young Turks, to study in Europe and try and bring back industrialism, try and bring back the science and medicine. That works, but it works a little too well. The Young Turks come back and they want to reform the Ottoman Empire. They actually overthrow the Sultan, but that creates chaos in the Ottoman Empire, which will eventually lead to its collapse. Our second nation we're going to talk about is Egypt. So Egypt had been a part of the Ottoman Empire, but at this point they were basically autonomous because the Ottomans could control them, mostly because of this guy, Muhammad Ali, not the boxer. He is a ruler of Egypt, and he does the same thing that the Ethiopians do. He sees colonization happening, so he begins to modernize his country. He promotes education. Again, he hires Western military experts to come in, retrain the Egyptian army. But he tries to do something that is kind of a new take on keeping the Europeans out, and he decides to build the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal, like I showed you on that map, it cuts the distance to travel from Europe to Asia. So he begins building it, but he underestimates how expensive it is, and he's unable to pay back the loans. So he sells his shares of the canal to Britain. And this gives Britain total control of the canal, essentially. And when there's a revolt against Muhammad Ali, the British say they need to protect the canal, and they pretty much put Egypt under British rule. Now it becomes a protectorate. And if you remember back to 6.1, a protectorate is where the nation still has its own government, they still have their own army, they rule themselves, but they're expected to listen to their colonizer. The British don't care about anything other than the canal. Egypt can do what they want to do as long as that canal stays open and Britain has its access to the Indian Ocean and to India and China. Our last kind of example we're going to study is Russia and Britain and Persia engaging in what's called the Great Game. So the Great Game is really between Russia and Britain over Persia. Russia was in the north, Britain was in the south with their control of India, and Persia was in the middle, and Britain and Russia want to keep each other away from their colonies. So Britain's goal is to protect India from Russia coming down and trying to get a piece of it. Russia's goal is to protect its actual empire from the British pushing up north. They both want to control all the oil that is located in this area. So what they agree to do is have a sphere of influence in the area. Neither has control of Persia, but both have access to Persia so they can sell it things and they can make money off it. Remember, in a sphere of control or a sphere of influence, you don't actually have control of the area, but you're trying to keep other Europeans or other colonial powers out of that area to keep them away from your empire. So these two cartoons kind of explain the Great Game. You can see here Russia represented by the bear, Britain, the lion, and the Persian cat here, and it's separating Britain and Russia from each other so they don't get into fight. It's the harmless cat. It keeps the two major powers apart from each other so they don't fight, but then both of them kind of have control of the Persian cat. So I hope this helped clear up 6.2 and 6.3, and if you have any questions, just let me know.